The hallway was silent, but inside her chest, everything was screaming. The words had already been spoken, the damage already done, and yet time seemed frozen in that moment when a phone call ended after just 11 seconds. In that fragile pause between breath and heartbreak, one of the strongest sibling bonds in music history began to fracture. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss another untold story. On May 17, 1993, the world watched Michael Jackson step up to a podium, microphones clustered like witnesses to a moment that would echo far beyond the press room. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. The king of pop, already a global icon burdened by fame, scrutiny, and expectation, stood ready to speak. But what he said that day would ripple not only across headlines, but through the heart of his sister, Janet Jackson, in a way no one could have predicted. This is not just a story about a press conference. It is a story about family. It is a story about silence. And it is a story about how 11 seconds of conversation nearly destroyed a bond that had been forged since childhood, in living rooms filled with music, in studios filled with dreams, and in the shared struggle of becoming legends together. This is the story of Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson, and the phone call that shattered everything. The weight of a name. To understand the gravity of that moment, we must first understand what it meant to be a Jackson. The Jackson family was not just a family. It was an institution, a dynasty, a living symbol of musical excellence, discipline, sacrifice, and ambition. From the moment Michael Jackson and his siblings stepped onto stages as children, their lives became public property. Their victories were celebrated. Their struggles were dissected. Their family dynamics were speculated on endlessly. Michael Jackson, the youngest star of the Jackson 5, grew up under lights that never dimmed. By adulthood, he had become the most famous entertainer on earth, a man whose voice could stop traffic, whose dance could stop time, whose image was etched into global consciousness. But behind that glittering exterior was a man shaped by intense pressure, isolation, and a lifelong desire to protect his family, especially his mother. Janet Jackson, meanwhile, carved her own path. She refused to be defined by her last name alone. Through talent, determination, and an unshakable sense of independence, she built her own empire, redefining pop and R&B in the process. Yet despite her success, her heart remained tethered to her family, particularly to Michael. Michael and Janet were not just siblings. They were allies, confidants, survivors of the same childhood battlefield. They understood each other in ways no one else could. They shared memories that no biography could fully capture. They carried the same scars and the same love. Which is why what happened in May 1993 cut so deeply. The press conference that changed everything. On May 17, 1993, Michael Jackson stood before reporters to address ongoing rumors, pressures, and public scrutiny surrounding his personal life. The media climate was already volatile. Speculation was rampant. The world wanted answers, and Michael felt compelled to speak. What he said about his family, particularly his father and his upbringing, was deeply personal. It was raw, it was emotional, and it was something he had rarely discussed publicly in such a vulnerable way. He spoke of pain. He spoke of discipline. He spoke of fear. And he spoke of his mother. To many, it was a brave moment. To others, it was controversial. Headlines exploded. Articles dissected every sentence. Television anchors replayed clips on endless loops. The world leaned in. But somewhere far away from the cameras, Janet Jackson was listening, not as a fan, not as a journalist, but as a daughter and a sister. And what she heard broke her heart. 11 seconds that changed a lifetime. After the press conference aired, Janet did not call Michael immediately. She needed time to breathe, time to process, time to understand how her brother could speak so openly about their family, about their upbringing, about their mother, in such a public forum. Eventually, she picked up the phone. When Michael Jackson answered, he likely expected comfort, support, understanding, perhaps even relief. But what he heard instead was silence heavy with emotion. Janet listened. And then, after just 11 seconds, she hung up. No argument. No explanation. No goodbye. Just the click of a line disconnecting. And with it, the unspoken fracture of a bond decades in the making. For 7 months, they did not speak. 7 months of unanswered calls. 7 months of unreturned messages. 7 months of emotional distance between two people who had once been inseparable. And during that silence, the pain only grew. Janet's perspective, the daughter before the star. To the public, Michael Jackson was an icon. To Janet, he was her brother. She had grown up watching their mother, Katherine Jackson, endure years of stress, sacrifice, and responsibility. She had watched her mother hold the family together, often in the face of immense pressure. And when Michael spoke publicly about their family, Janet felt that her mother's pain was being exposed to the world without her consent. It wasn't about whether Michael's words were true. It wasn't about whether his pain was valid. It was about how those words made their mother feel. For Janet, family loyalty was sacred. Privacy was protection. And airing deeply personal family struggles on a global stage felt, to her, like a betrayal, not of truth but of trust. She did not want to fight Michael. She did not want to attack him. She did not want to turn this into a public feud. So she chose silence. But silence, as she would later realize, can be just as loud as confrontation. Michael's perspective, the son who never felt free. Michael Jackson's life had always been defined by contradiction. He was adored by millions but felt alone. He was surrounded by people but deeply isolated. He was wealthy beyond imagination but haunted by a childhood he felt he never had. For years, Michael had carried emotional weight in silence. He had internalized pain, fear, and pressure, often protecting his family even when he felt hurt by them. But by 1993, the emotional toll had become unbearable. He did not speak at that press conference to hurt his family. He did not speak to embarrass his mother. He spoke because he could no longer carry the weight alone. Michael Jackson was trying to reclaim his story. And yet, in doing so, he inadvertently wounded the person who loved him most outside of his mother. When Janet hung up that phone after 11 seconds, Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. He had lost not just a sister, but a source of emotional safety. The silence that followed became a punishment more painful than any headline. 7 months of silence. Time moved on, but the wound did not heal. Michael continued his work, but the absence of Janet weighed heavily on him. Family gatherings felt incomplete. Moments of joy felt hollow. Every success felt slightly less meaningful without her presence. Janet, meanwhile, was struggling in her own way. She was touring, recording, performing, smiling for cameras, but behind the scenes she carried unresolved grief. She missed her brother. She missed his laughter. She missed his vulnerability. She missed the way he understood her without words. But she could not bring herself to reach out. Pride, pain, protection. These emotions formed a wall between them, higher with every passing day. The turning point. 7 months after that phone call, something shifted. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't a public apology. It was something far quieter. Janet realized that holding onto pain was costing her more than letting go. She realized that the silence meant losing not just a conversation, but a relationship. And she realized that no matter how hurt she felt, she loved her brother more than she loved being right. Michael, too, was ready. He had spent months replaying that moment, 11 seconds. He wondered what he could have said differently. He wondered how he could have explained himself better. He wondered how to bridge the gap. When they finally spoke again, it wasn't dramatic. It was gentle. It was emotional. It was human. There were tears. There were apologies. There were long pauses where words were unnecessary. And slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. Forgiveness is not instant, it is intentional. Forgiveness did not come all at once. It did not erase the past. It did not make the pain disappear, but it opened the door to healing. Janet forgave Michael, not because she forgot what he said, but because she chose love over resentment. Michael asked for forgiveness, not because he believed he was wrong to speak, but because he understood how his words had hurt someone he loved. Their reconciliation was not a fairy tale ending. It was a realistic one. They did not suddenly become the same people they had been before. They did not erase the scars. They learned to carry them together. The deeper meaning behind the phone call. That 11-second phone call was never just about a press conference. It was about boundaries. It was about pain. It was about the difference between truth and timing. It was about how even the strongest love can fracture when communication fails. Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson were not just celebrities navigating fame. They were siblings navigating trauma, loyalty, and identity in a world that rarely allowed them privacy. Their story reminds us that no matter how famous someone is, their family struggles are just as raw, just as complicated, and just as human as anyone else. Michael Jackson, the man behind the myth. When we talk about Michael Jackson, we often talk about music, dance, innovation, and legacy. But moments like this remind us that behind the legend was a man who longed for understanding, connection, and peace. Michael Jackson was not perfect. He was not infallible. He was not immune to pain. But he was deeply emotional, deeply sensitive, deeply human. And the way he eventually repaired his relationship with Janet speaks volumes about his capacity for humility and love. Janet Jackson, strength in silence, strength in forgiveness. Janet Jackson's response to the situation reveals a different kind of strength. Not the strength of confrontation, not the strength of dominance, but the strength of restraint. She chose not to publicly attack her brother. She chose not to fuel media narratives. She chose silence, not as punishment but as self-protection. And when she chose to forgive, she did so privately, intentionally, and with emotional maturity. Her strength was not loud. It was quiet. It was resilient. It was transformative. The power of 11 seconds. In a world where people speak for hours without being heard, 11 seconds were enough to change everything. That phone call reminds us that communication is not just about words. It's about timing, intention, and emotional readiness. Sometimes, silence is not the absence of communication. Sometimes it is communication itself. And sometimes, forgiveness begins not with an apology, but with a decision to pick up the phone again. A story larger than fame. This story is not just about Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson. It is about families everywhere. It is about siblings who grow up together and grow apart. It is about misunderstandings that spiral into distance. It is about pride that blocks healing. And it is about love that, when given a chance, finds its way back. No amount of fame can protect you from family pain. No amount of success can replace family connection. No amount of silence can erase love. The final lesson. The 11-second phone call that destroyed Michael and Janet's relationship did not define them. What defined them was what came after. Their willingness to forgive. Their courage to reconnect. Their commitment to family, even when it hurt. Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson did not let one moment of pain erase a lifetime of love. And that may be the most powerful part of their story. The story did not end with forgiveness. It deepened. Because when two people like Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson walk through silence, reconciliation is not a finish line. It is a beginning. A beginning filled with cautious words, fragile trust, and a renewed understanding of how easily love can be wounded and how powerfully it can heal. In the months after their reconciliation, something subtle changed between them. It wasn't visible in headlines. It wasn't announced in interviews. But in private conversations, in shared moments away from cameras, there was a tenderness that hadn't existed before. They listened more carefully. They spoke more gently. They protected each other more fiercely. And for the first time, both siblings truly understood that love, without communication, is not enough. The aftermath, healing in the shadows. When Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson finally spoke again after 7 months of silence, neither of them rushed to explain everything. There were no speeches, no justifications, no attempts to win the argument. Instead, there were pauses. Long pauses. The kind of pauses where pain breathes, where memories surface, where hearts decide whether to remain guarded or begin to open. Michael apologized, not in a rehearsed, public way, but in a quiet, brotherly way. He did not apologize for his truth. He apologized for the pain it caused. Janet did not immediately say, "It's okay." Instead, she said something far more powerful. "I was hurt." Those 3 words carried the weight of 7 months of silence. They carried disappointment. They carried confusion. They carried love that had nowhere to go. And Michael listened. Not as a global superstar. Not as a cultural icon. But as a brother. That was the moment healing truly began. Rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. Trust, once broken, does not return all at once. It returns in fragments. It returns in small moments. In shared laughter. In mutual vulnerability. In honest conversations that don't end abruptly. Michael and Janet began to talk more frequently, but not about the press conference, not about headlines, not about rumors. They talked about their childhood, about their mother, about their dreams, about their fears. They talked about the parts of themselves the world never saw. Michael spoke about loneliness. Janet spoke about independence. Michael spoke about guilt. Janet spoke about responsibility. And through those conversations, they rediscovered not only each other, but themselves. The unspoken guilt. One of the most painful parts of this story is something neither sibling spoke about publicly at the time: guilt. Michael carried guilt for hurting Janet. Janet carried guilt for cutting him off. Neither had intended to harm the other. Michael never intended to expose his family in a way that caused pain. Janet never intended to abandon her brother emotionally. But intention does not erase impact. And both of them felt the weight of that. Michael, who had always felt responsible for protecting his family, now felt responsible for fracturing it. He questioned whether his need to speak had been selfish. He questioned whether he had failed as a son, as a brother. Janet, who had always felt responsible for holding the family together emotionally, now felt responsible for letting distance grow. She questioned whether her silence had been too harsh, whether her boundaries had become walls. And yet, in the middle of that guilt, something extraordinary happened. They chose grace. Grace in the face of pain. Grace is not forgetting. Grace is remembering and choosing love anyway. Michael and Janet did not pretend the phone call never happened. They did not erase the press conference from memory. They did not rewrite history. They accepted it. They accepted that pain had occurred. They accepted that mistakes had been made. They accepted that both were human. And in that acceptance, they found peace. Michael learned that truth must be spoken with care. Janet learned that love must be expressed even in disagreement. Together, they learned that silence can protect, but it can also isolate. The ripple effect through the Jackson family. The fracture between Michael and Janet did not exist in isolation. It rippled through the entire Jackson family. Their mother, Katherine Jackson, sensed the tension long before it was acknowledged. She felt the absence at family gatherings. She felt the emotional weight when her children were not in harmony. She did not pressure them. She did not demand reconciliation. She simply waited, and waited, and hoped. When they finally reconciled, it was not just a reunion between siblings. It was a healing moment for the family itself. Catherine, who had endured years of stress and sacrifice, finally saw her children come back together emotionally. And that, more than any public apology or statement, meant everything to her. Why the press conference hurt so deeply. To understand why Janet reacted so strongly to Michael's words, one must understand her relationship with their mother. Katherine Jackson was not just a parent, she was the emotional anchor of the family. She was the protector, the mediator, the heart. Janet saw her mother as someone who had carried unbearable weight quietly, without complaint. Someone who had sacrificed personal dreams for the sake of her children's success. Someone who had endured public scrutiny with grace. When Michael spoke publicly about the family's struggles, Janet felt that her mother's privacy had been violated, not maliciously, but painfully. It wasn't about denying Michael's experience. It was about protecting their mother's dignity. And in Janet's mind, silence was the only way to do that. Michael's inner conflict. Michael Jackson, meanwhile, had lived most of his life in emotional isolation. Fame had separated him from normal human experiences. Trust was rare. Vulnerability was dangerous. For years, he had suppressed his pain to protect his family's image. But suppression has consequences. By 1993, the emotional weight had become too heavy to carry alone. When he spoke at that press conference, he wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't trying to start a scandal. He was trying to breathe. And yet, the cost of that breath was a relationship he treasured. That contradiction haunted him. The silence between siblings. Silence between strangers can be peaceful. Silence between siblings is unbearable. Michael and Janet had grown up together. They had shared bedrooms, rehearsals, stages, and dreams. They had shared laughter and exhaustion, triumph and fear. They had shared everything, except now suddenly they shared nothing. No phone calls. No laughter. No comfort. Only absence. And absence, when it comes from someone you love, hurts more than presence from someone you don't. The emotional toll. During those 7 months, both siblings experienced emotional decline, but in different ways. Michael became more withdrawn. He immersed himself in work. He poured his energy into creativity, but beneath that productivity was emotional exhaustion. Janet became more guarded. She maintained her independence. She continued building her career, but beneath her strength was unresolved sadness. Both were hurting. Both were lonely. And neither knew how to reach the other without reopening wounds. The moment of courage. Reconciliation requires courage. Not the courage to win, but the courage to be vulnerable. The moment Janet decided to speak again was not spontaneous. It came after deep reflection. It came after emotional exhaustion. It came after realizing that holding onto pain was costing her more than releasing it. Michael, too, had reached a breaking point, not of anger but of longing. He missed his sister. He missed her presence. He missed the comfort of knowing that someone understood him without explanation. When they finally spoke again, it was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet surrender. They surrendered pride. They surrendered resentment. They surrendered fear. And in doing so, they reclaimed love. What forgiveness really means. Forgiveness is often misunderstood. It is not saying, what you did didn't hurt. It is saying, what you did hurt, but I choose not to let that pain define our future. Janet forgave Michael not because she minimized her pain, but because she valued their relationship more than her anger. Michael accepted forgiveness not because he felt blameless, but because he recognized the responsibility he held in causing harm. This mutual understanding created a foundation stronger than before, not because it was untouched by pain, but because it had survived it. A bond tested by fame. Few sibling relationships in history have been tested the way Michael and Janet was. Fame magnifies everything. It magnifies success. It magnifies failure. It magnifies conflict. It magnifies misunderstanding. When ordinary siblings argue, the conflict stays private. When Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson experienced conflict, it became a potential media storm. Every word could be misinterpreted. Every silence could be speculated on. Every reunion could be scrutinized. And yet, they chose to keep their reconciliation private. They did not use it for publicity. They did not monetize it. They did not dramatize it. They protected it. Why this story matters? This story matters not because Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson are famous, but because they are human. It matters because it shows that even the strongest bonds can break. It matters because it shows that silence can be both a shield and a weapon. It matters because it shows that forgiveness is not automatic, it is intentional. And most importantly, it matters because it shows that reconciliation is possible, even after profound hurt. Lessons from 11 seconds. What can we learn from an 11-second phone call? We can learn that words spoken publicly can have private consequences. We can learn that silence can communicate more than speech. We can learn that family relationships require care, intention, and emotional honesty. We can learn that love does not eliminate conflict, but it can survive it. And we can learn that reconciliation is not about forgetting the past, but about choosing the future. Michael Jackson's emotional legacy. Michael Jackson's legacy is often discussed in terms of music, dance, and innovation, but his emotional legacy is just as powerful. He showed the world what vulnerability looks like. He showed the world what pain looks like. He showed the world what forgiveness looks like. And through his relationship with Janet, he showed that even legends must navigate family dynamics just like everyone else. Janet Jackson's quiet strength. Janet Jackson's strength has always been quiet. She did not scream her pain. She did not broadcast her hurt. She did not turn her grief into spectacle. She processed it privately. She protected her family. She protected herself. And when she was ready, she forgave. That kind of strength is rare. The power of reconnection. Reconnection does not erase pain, but it transforms it. When Michael and Janet reconnected, they did not become who they were before. They became something stronger. They became siblings who had seen the worst of emotional distance and chosen closeness anyway. They became people who understood that relationships are not sustained by perfection, but by effort. A relationship redefined. After their reconciliation, their relationship changed, not in love but in depth. They spoke more honestly. They listened more carefully. They valued each other more deeply. They no longer assumed understanding, they sought it. They no longer avoided discomfort, they faced it. And in doing so, they created a relationship that was not only loving, but resilient. The unseen moments. There are moments in life that the world never sees. Moments of apology. Moments of forgiveness. Moments of reconciliation. Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson shared many of these moments privately. No cameras, no headlines, no audience, just two siblings choosing love. And perhaps that is the most beautiful part of this story. Not the public drama, but the private healing. The true cost of silence. Silence can protect, but it can also isolate. Janet's silence protected her heart. Michael's silence deepened his loneliness. Both learned that silence, when prolonged, becomes distance. And distance, when unaddressed, becomes loss. But silence, when broken intentionally, becomes healing. The story continues. The story of Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson did not end with forgiveness. It continued through shared moments, through creative collaborations, through mutual support. They did not let one moment define their relationship. They let love define it. Why we tell this story? We tell this story not to sensationalize pain, but to humanize it. We tell this story not to judge, but to understand. We tell this story because it reminds us that no matter who you are, no matter how successful you become, no matter how powerful your name is, relationships still require care. And love still requires communication. The final reflection. If an 11-second phone call can destroy a relationship, then a single conversation can also save it. If silence can separate, then vulnerability can reconnect. If pain can fracture, then forgiveness can heal. Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson's story is not one of destruction, it is one of restoration. And that is a story worth telling. If this continuation moved you, helped you reflect, or reminded you of someone you love, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this story. Your support keeps these untold stories alive and helps others find healing through understanding. Thank you for being part of this journey.